When my husband passed, his children from his first marriage told me, "You should move out, this house isn't really yours." I nodded quietly. 3 weeks later, they found out whose name was actually on the deed. I still remember the sound of rain that morning. It wasn't a gentle drizzle, it was the kind of cold, steady rain that seeps into your bones. The kind that makes every goodbye feel heavier. That was the day we buried my husband, Robert. We had been married for 27 years. He was my second chance at love, and I was his. We'd met later in life, he was widowed, I was divorced, and together, we'd built a quiet kind of happiness. We weren't rich, we weren't glamorous, but we had warmth. And a small home filled with photographs, laughter, and the smell of his favorite black coffee. When he passed, everything felt like it collapsed into silence. But the silence didn't last long. After the service, people started leaving, some patting my shoulder, others whispering condolences they'd forget by the next day. And that's when they approached me. His children from his first marriage, Ellen and Mark, they hadn't been close to their father for years. They visited maybe once a year, always with a sense of duty rather than love. Still, I'd always treated them with kindness, hoping that one day they might see me as part of their family. But standing there beside their father's grave, they looked at me like I was an inconvenience they needed to manage. Ellen spoke first. She had her mother's sharp jaw and her father's voice, steady, but cold. Look, she said, we think it's best if you move out of Dad's house. You know, just while we sort things out. I stared at her, unsure if I'd heard correctly. Move out? I repeated softly. Mark crossed his arms. Yeah. It's just, this house belonged to our family. Our mother. Dad probably meant for it to go back to us. Our family. Our mother. The words hit me harder than I expected. I wanted to remind them that for almost 3 decades, I'd been the one washing those walls, planting those roses, holding their father's hand when he couldn't remember his own name anymore. But instead, I just looked down at the wet ground and whispered, I understand. They nodded, almost relieved that I wasn't putting up a fight. Then Ellen patted my arm, like I was some fragile old woman who'd finally accepted her place, and said, it's for the best. I nodded again. Of course, I said quietly. But as they walked away, holding umbrellas that matched their polished black shoes, something inside me shifted. It wasn't anger at first. It was grief. Not for my husband this time, but for the years I'd spent trying to be part of a family that never wanted me. That night, I sat alone in the house, staring at the framed wedding photo on the mantel. The one where Robert and I were smiling under a willow tree, both a little older, both thinking we'd finally found peace. I guess they never saw this as mine, I whispered. But Robert. Robert had known better. 3 weeks before he passed, we'd had one of those quiet, late-night talks you only have when you realize time is running out. He was already weak then, sitting up in bed with a blanket over his shoulders. I know how my kids can be, he said softly. They don't mean harm, but they don't understand loyalty the way you do. I held his hand, brushing my thumb over the thin skin of his knuckles. Don't worry about me, I told him. I'll be fine. He smiled faintly. Oh, I know you will. But I also know you don't like confrontation. So I made sure you'll never have to argue with them. I thought he meant the funeral arrangements or the will. I didn't ask. At that moment, I was too focused on memorizing the sound of his voice. But now, sitting alone in our living room 3 weeks after his death, those words replayed in my mind. I made sure you'll never have to argue with them. And I began to understand what he meant. Because on the kitchen counter, still sealed in an envelope with my name on it, was a document Robert had left me, the one I hadn't had the heart to open yet. That night, I finally did. And when I saw what it was, a tear rolled down my cheek, not from sadness this time, but from quiet, undeniable relief. It was the house deed, and it was in my name. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight spilling through the curtains, the first morning since the funeral that didn't feel entirely gray. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the deed spread out before me. My name was right there, written clearly in Robert's neat handwriting beside the notary seal. Margaret and Walters, it read. Sole owner. For a moment, I just stared at it, tracing my finger over the letters. It felt almost unreal. Robert had quietly made sure I would never be pushed out of the home we built together. He knew his children better than I ever could have admitted out loud. I folded the document carefully and placed it in a blue folder. Something told me I'd be needing it soon. And I was right. 2 days later, there was a knock at my door. When I opened it, Ellen and Mark stood there, no smiles, no warmth. Just that tight politeness people wear when they think they're about to get what they want. Hi, Margaret. Ellen said, her voice sugar-coated but sharp around the edges. We were just in the neighborhood. Thought we'd stop by and talk about next steps. Next steps? I asked, even though I already knew what she meant. Yeah, Mark chimed in, stepping past me without waiting for an invitation. You know, sorting through Dad's stuff, getting the house appraised, things like that. I watched them walk into my living room, the one I'd decorated with Robert's favorite navy curtains, the one that still smelled faintly of his aftershave, and for a moment, I felt that old sting of being treated like a guest in my own life. But not this time. Ellen took a seat on the couch, crossing her legs like she was already planning which corner of the house would be hers. We figured it's best to put the place on the market, she said briskly. Prices are good right now, and Dad would have wanted us to split things fairly. Fairly? I repeated softly. Yes, she said, flashing that polite smile again. Of course you'd get something too, don't worry. Maybe we can help you find a small condo or something nearby. Mark nodded as if the decision had already been made. It's what's best for everyone. I looked at them both, two adults in their 40s who still believed the world bent around what they wanted, and for the first time in a long while, I felt no need to shrink back. I just smiled and said, "That's very thoughtful of you. Why don't we sit down and talk about it properly?" They looked relieved, maybe even smug, thinking I was going to go along with their plan. I went to the kitchen, took a deep breath, and returned with a tray of tea. Old habits die hard, even when your guests are vultures circling your roof. As they sipped, Ellen started outlining timelines, appraisers, estate lawyers, even potential buyers she knew through a friend. I let her talk. Every word she spoke made the next moment feel sweeter. When she was done, she looked up at me expectantly. So, does that sound reasonable? I smiled gently. It does. But before we go any further, I think you should see something. I reached for the blue folder I'd placed on the coffee table earlier, the one I'd been saving for exactly this moment. Ellen's eyes followed my hand, curiosity flickering for just a second. What's that? She asked. Something Robert left behind, I said. He wanted to make sure things were clear. I slid the folder toward her. She opened it slowly, her expression neutral at first, until she saw the words. Property deed. Sole ownership, Margaret and Walters. Her hand froze midair. The color drained from her face. Mark leaned over to look and frowned. Wait, what's this? That, I said softly, is the deed to the house. Robert transferred it to my name last spring. Everything was notarized and filed. Ellen blinked rapidly, then forced a laugh that sounded more like a gasp. That can't be right. Dad would never. He did, I interrupted gently. He said he wanted to make sure I'd be safe. And I suppose, he was right to worry. Mark sat back, his jaw tightening. You're lying, he muttered. You tricked him. I met his eyes calmly. You can call the county office if you'd like. The paperwork's on file. Public record. For a few seconds, no one spoke. The only sound was the clock ticking above the mantel, the same clock Robert and I bought at a flea market our first year together. Ellen set the folder down like it had burned her fingers. You don't understand, she said. That house was supposed to stay in our family. I tilted my head. It did. Robert and I were family. She flinched at that, and I realized then that this wasn't just about money or property. It was about pride. About them never accepting that their father had chosen someone else after their mother. When they finally stood to leave, Ellen's voice trembled with frustration. This isn't over. I smiled faintly. No, I suppose it's not. After they drove off, I sat back on the couch and let out a long breath. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was something else, a strange mix of power and peace I hadn't felt in years. Robert had protected me even after death. But something told me Ellen and Mark wouldn't give up easily. And I was right. Because that night, at exactly 10:42 p.m., I got a text from an unknown number. Enjoy the house while you can. Today on the show, we're diving into the world of indicators. These are the numbers that tell us how the economy is doing, things like GDP, unemployment rates, and consumer confidence. But what do these indicators really mean? How are they calculated? And how should we interpret them? We'll break it all down for you, with the help of some experts, to make sense of the numbers that shape our world. The message, "Enjoy the house while you can," glowed on my screen like a threat wrapped in smugness. I stared at it for a long time, not sure if I wanted to laugh or cry. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it. But then, something inside me, something tired, something that had spent decades shrinking to keep peace, decided it was time to stop. I put the phone down, stood up, and walked through each room of the house. The walls still held Robert's warmth. The shelves still carried our memories, our wedding photo, the seashell lamp he bought me, the little ceramic owl he always said looked wise enough to pay taxes. No one was going to take this away from me. Not while I was breathing. The next morning, I went to the county records office. The clerk, a young woman with kind eyes, printed out a copy of the title and stamped it again, Margaret and Walters, sole owner. She smiled. "Keep a few copies," she said. "Families can get complicated." I chuckled. "You have no idea." When I got home, I found Ellen's SUV parked outside. She was pacing on the porch like a storm waiting to break. "Ellen," I said, unlocking the door. "You should have called." She turned sharply. "Mark talked to a lawyer," she snapped. "He said there's no way Dad would have transferred everything to you. We're contesting it." I sighed softly. "You can try, dear. But I wouldn't waste the money." Her eyes narrowed. "You think you're clever, don't you? You wormed your way into his life. Into our family. And now you're living in my own home?" I interrupted calmly. "Yes, I suppose I am." That only made her angrier. Her face went red, and her voice trembled. "You'll regret this." I looked at her for a long moment, really looked. And for the first time, I didn't see a villain. I saw a scared little girl who had lost her father twice, once to divorce, and once to death. But pity didn't mean surrender. I opened the door wider and said, "Ellen, grief doesn't give you the right to be cruel. You don't have to fight me. But if you do, I'll win." Then I closed the door. That night, I brewed chamomile tea and sat at Robert's old desk. I opened his files, one by one, and found exactly what I'd hoped: years of handwritten letters, receipts, life insurance documents, even the notarized statement he'd left for the lawyer. He had planned everything meticulously. And tucked between the papers was a note in his handwriting: "If they ever forget who stood by me, remind them, gently, but clearly." I smiled through tears. "Oh, Robert," I whispered. "You always did love your riddles." So, I got to work. 3 days later, I invited Ellen and Mark back to the house. My tone was sweet, almost apologetic. "I think we should talk. About the estate. I don't want any confusion." They arrived looking smug. Perhaps they thought I was giving in. We sat in the dining room, the same place we'd celebrated Christmases and birthdays for nearly 20 years. I had tea ready and a small stack of papers neatly arranged beside me. Ellen smirked. "So, you've come to your senses?" I smiled back. "In a way, yes. I realized you might not know the full story. Robert left something behind that you should both see." Mark leaned forward suspiciously. "What kind of something?" Without answering, I handed them each a letter, one in Robert's handwriting. They opened them. I watched as their expressions shifted from arrogance to disbelief to something that looked a lot like shame. Ellen's voice cracked first. He said you paid the mortgage for 10 years?" I nodded. "While he was helping Mark through law school, I handled the house payments. We both agreed I'd earn my share in peace of mind, not arguments." Mark looked down at his page. "He said he wanted you to have everything. Because you understood what partnership meant." There was a long, heavy silence. Even the ticking clock seemed to pause out of respect. Then Ellen whispered, "He never told us that." "No," I said softly. "He didn't want to embarrass you." Her eyes filled with tears, but pride kept them from falling. She folded the letter and stood up abruptly. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't," I replied kindly. "Just remember, this house wasn't taken from you. It was given to me. With love. And with purpose." They left quietly this time, no raised voices, no threats. Just silence. For a few days after that, things were peaceful. I tended to my garden, fed the neighbor's cat, and for the first time since Robert's passing, slept without nightmares. But peace, I've learned, rarely lasts when pride is wounded. Because a week later, I received a letter from an attorney. Ellen and Mark were officially contesting the will. And I knew, the quiet storm was about to turn into a war. The envelope sat on my kitchen table for a full day before I opened it. "Notice of intent to contest will," the heading read. I laughed softly, not out of humor, but disbelief. After all the evidence, after Robert's own words, his children still refused to accept reality. But grief can twist people. Pride, even more so. So instead of crying or panicking, I brewed tea, opened my notebook, and began planning my next move. The first thing I did was call Robert's lawyer, Mr. Collins, a calm, gray-haired man with the patience of a saint. When I told him about the letter, he chuckled gently. "Don't worry, Margaret," he said. "Robert anticipated this might happen." "Anticipated?" I asked. He paused, as if savoring a secret. "He asked me to hold one final document in case they contested the will. I'll prepare a meeting." I hung up, my heart racing. Whatever Robert had done, he had thought of everything. The meeting was set for Friday morning at the attorney's office. When I arrived, Ellen and Mark were already there, looking smug and impatient. Mark was dressed like he was heading to court, sleek black suit, shiny shoes, arrogance polished to perfection. Ellen avoided eye contact but held her chin high. Mr. Collins greeted everyone warmly, then placed a large brown envelope on the desk. Your father, he began, left this sealed document, to be opened only in the event of a dispute. I believe now is the appropriate time. The room went silent. He opened the envelope, unfolded a few pages, and began reading. To my children, Ellen and Mark, if you are hearing this, I suppose you couldn't resist one more argument. You've always been passionate, and I love that. But passion without truth is just noise. This house was paid for not by me, but by Margaret, for 10 years, while I supported your education, your homes, your lives. Without her, none of us would have had what we did. You may think she took something from you, but she gave more than you'll ever know. So if you choose to fight her, understand this, you will lose, not just legally, but morally. And if you still decide to continue, I've made arrangements for the trust funds to be redirected to charity. Choose wisely. With love, Dad. When Mr. Collins finished reading, no one spoke. Ellen looked pale, her lips trembling. Mark clenched his jaw but said nothing. Finally, Ellen whispered, He really said that? Mr. Collins nodded. It's signed, notarized, and recorded. Mark shot me a glare, then looked at the floor. This is ridiculous, he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. I sat quietly, hands folded on my lap, letting the silence do the work. After a long pause, Ellen stood up. We're done, she said softly. Mark, let's go. He hesitated, but followed her out. And just like that, it was over. When I got home, I walked through the house slowly. The air felt lighter. The walls didn't seem to carry tension anymore, just peace. I stood by Robert's old chair and whispered, You handled it beautifully, my love. On the mantel, I placed a photo of us from our first Christmas together, him in a ridiculous sweater, me laughing so hard my eyes were shut. Next to it, I set one of his fountain pens. Your final lesson, I murmured. Sometimes strength isn't in fighting back, it's in knowing when to let the truth speak for you. That night, as the sun dipped below the trees, my phone buzzed. A message from Ellen. I found some of Dad's old letters. He wrote about you, how happy you made him. I'm sorry for everything. Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't from sadness this time. I typed back, he loved you both very much. Maybe now we can stop fighting over what he left and start remembering who he was. She replied with a single heart emoji. A week later, I hosted a small gathering, just the neighbors, some close friends, a few faces that had stood by me through the storm. We sat in the garden Robert had built, surrounded by flowers he planted years ago. As laughter filled the evening air, I realized something simple yet profound. I hadn't just won a legal battle, I had reclaimed my peace. The house wasn't just bricks and memories anymore. It was proof that love, even after death, can protect you if you've lived it honestly. And when I looked up at the stars that night, I whispered, Thank you, Robert. You always did know how to end a story.